Jazzcast Pros.
When we think about governments, institutions, and you think about historical trauma, institutional racism, structural racism, generational trauma, the benefit that the country and American businesses, international businesses have benefited from just the inception of how this republic was. You steal it and then you take others to work it. Yeah, you're going to be pretty successful, I think. That's a pretty good start. There's no bootstraps. And this is a reality. And there's got to be a level of humility that New York State comes to the table with the Seneca Nation. It's so what if the Seneca Nation has made a lot of money off of gaming and whatever. No matter what you make out of that, it'll never be able to be a fair and equitable exchange for what was done to Native people. The genocide that was a result of this experiment, American experiment, it's related to thinking can impinge upon a person's existence, their land, their religion, their hairstyle, that you, in your position of authority, have the right to go and just take. And quite frankly, I would argue that the Seneca Nation doesn't owe New York State anything.
Hello, good morning, good day, good afternoon, whatever time of the day you may be tuning in and listening to us. We thank you, all of our listeners, for tuning in for your weekly dose of hope with the Igniting Hope Radio podcast brought to you by the Buffalo Center for Health Equity. It's your host, co-host, Kimberly Slugarambe. As always, I'm here with Pastor G, and we always have an exciting new guest with us weekly. This week, she is someone who is dear to the Buffalo Center for Health Equity. She is an amazing member of the African American Health Equity Task Force, and in her day-to-day role, she is the healthcare advocate organizer for HEP, the Healthcare Education Project, and she's a member of the 1199 SEIU, and of course, she's a proud member of the Seneca Nation, none other than Samantha Nephew.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me on today.
Sam, it's always so good to have a conversation with you, and as you know, committed and concerned about the conditions of African Americans as it relates to their health outcomes. In my Bible study the other day, we were talking about the country and how sometimes we, in America, we have this revised view of history and how things came to be. And in a lot of ways, I described, the place that we reside as a crime scene, a place where, a tremendous crime was committed. The trespassing and stealing and occupying of land that by people who, that's not their land, but they just took it. And then the enslavement, the stealing, the kidnapping of people from another nation to come and to work the soil. And somehow we've romanticized that. And I think that we need to really begin to start telling the truth about things, not just to make people feel bad. It's not even about feeling bad. But if you don't operate with truth from your foundation, then everything that you do off of that will ever lead you to a place of justice and righteousness. And so we've pretty much, we've documented what's going on in the African American community, especially as it relates to COVID. Talk about mental health. So what are you seeing? What are you hearing that's happening in the indigenous community? And that's the term I use, because indigenous means, native to the spaces that it was. Even the term, I struggle even with the term Native America, because it wasn't America, right? It's so at every kind of definition. I know the Cleveland Indians just changed the name of their baseball team this year, and so we've just used all these pejorative names to describe the people that this is where, God had planted them on this earth. And so can you tell me a little bit about what's happening in those communities? So let's just chop it up.
I get that all the time. Is what do you like to be called? Well, first of all, I'm Samantha.
Right.
And then second, we always talk about Native American, African American, Hispanic American. What does it all mean? The hyphenations. And I think that is definitely derived from just the othering of what is American, right? You know that. And then the way I always look at it is, Native American is this really lazy way of lumping all of these different people together, right? Like, that's what they would call me here in Buffalo, but that's what they would also call Hopi and the Arizona area and so on and so forth. And yet there's tremendously different values and ceremonies and just outlooks and all of that, the way you would look at life. And so it's definitely interesting because nobody would ever, I've never heard anybody call me like a Seneca American. What is that? And I just think that that is, like I said, a very lazy way, but it's also an easy out, right? When you forget to include a Native American or a Seneca, like what does that mean? And it's a further form of erasure. I think that there is definitely a lot that goes into that because, like you said, indigenous doesn't necessarily just mean people of this land. We talk about it in this really broad term, but somebody who is born and raised in Ghana is indigenous to Africa. It's where they are. So it's definitely hard to do that, but I don't think that we were supposed to be, all lumped in like that. I've definitely talked to some people who wish we would all just be American, but you can't separate, the fact that my entire, lineage comes from here. So definitely a lot of conversations on how do we go about identifying ourselves. All of that to say is you were right in all the terms. The Seneca Nation, right on our, our seal, all of the mail that I get, all of everything, it says Seneca Nation of Indians. So there's no one right way. I think we all just have our preferences on what we, want to be called. And then just moving into your question, what am I seeing? It mirrors a lot of what we see with the African American Health Equity Task Force. One of the reasons why I'm so involved in both arenas, obviously for the Health Equity Task, the African American Health Equity Task Force. I live in Buffalo. We don't have a huge, especially compared to, we don't have a huge population in the urban areas. Not a lot of places in the country do. A large portion of Native people tend to live in reservations, which tend to be more rural and just further away from urban cores, where the opposite is true. African Americans tend to live in urban cores and in areas like that. So I stay involved on this area because, again, I live in the city of Buffalo. I've grown up in the city of Buffalo. I went to Buffalo Public Schools. So the people that I consider close to me tend to identify as African American, Hispanic American, et cetera, et cetera. And those people, they're not statistics. They're my friends. They're my colleagues. They're my loved ones. And I care when a friend who is Black is pregnant, and we know what the, Black maternal health rate is. We care about when somebody gets diabetes. I care about when somebody has this, that, or the other happen to them. And so it's very important to me just on a very human level. Right? We haven't said the word human once in any of this, and we rarely do. But on a very human level, I just care about the people around me. And so that's why I tend to stay very involved in the communities that, we live in. And then, of course, I stay involved within the Native community as much as I can, large portions of it being situated between the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation, which is roughly around Irving, New York, and then, of course, the Allegheny Indian Reservation, which is more south, about Salamanca, closer to the Pennsylvania borderline. And those are two of the Seneca reservations, and I have family that live on both. So a lot of cousins, and my grandmother, who recently passed, lived in the Allegheny Indian Reservation. So obviously very close to both types of communities.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about health disparities, we always talk about the social determinants of health. Talk a little bit about the intersection, between our communities around those issues.
I think that a lot of people would be not surprised to say one of the big things is poverty. Mm-hmm. It's access. Honestly, like I said, growing up especially, I did not see a whole lot of wealth within my families, within our neighbors down that way. There's just not a whole lot of access. And even when the Seneca Nation does have a healthcare system, transportation can still be an issue. The nation does lots of ways to try to mitigate it, but it can still be an issue. And then, like you asked me about mental health, that tends to be a barrier for a lot of people. I won't name names, but within my own family, having conversations over the weekend at my grandmother's funeral, I heard names and situations where things aren't going well because they don't think to go to the doctor. It's not top of mind. And I truly believe it's fully rooted in poverty And of course, generational trauma, when we talk about that, which is something we could very much go into, which I believe has a huge implication for how a lot of Native people live today.
So when you talk about generational trauma, from your community, what kind of amplify on that and kind of explain to those who are listening how that impacts the mental state of being for someone right now?
So I would say one of the best examples of generational trauma that's come up and has been highlighted much more in national news, international really, because Canada is talking about it too, but is the idea of residential schools.
Yes.
And residential schools, yeah. So there were, as far as I remember, 2 within our region. The Thomas Indian School, and there was another one, in Steenburg, close by Steenburg in the Allegheny region. And I'll just, again, go from personal point of view. My great-grandmother was somebody who was in one of those schools. And in these schools, for our listeners, this wasn't, the school down the block, you
Right.
go there 7 to 3 kind of thing. These schools were designed to kill the Indian, save the man. That was actual rhetoric from the federal government at the time that said, we don't want the Indians, but they're people. So let's nix all of the culture. People would get beat if they spoke their language. Hair was cut. Hair is very important to a lot of Native cultures across the country. Braids and whatnot. It's just very important to the way we see ourselves and the way we connect to the earth and with the Creator. So all of those things were stripped away, and people were told that they were evil or they were the devil. They had Native names that they weren't allowed to use anymore. They were given, good Christian names.
Yeah, and speak a little bit about the role of the Christian church in this diabolical plot.
Well, yeah, it was definitely sanctioned by the federal government, but it was done hand in hand with the church.
Right.
It was nuns in these places that were teaching, that were hitting, that were doling out, negative consequences for children who deigned to do the only thing they knew. Oh, and they were stripped away from their families, mind you. I talk about the 2 schools that were here in this region, but people came from all over to these schools, and that was the case across the country. You were separated from your family, from your communities, so that you were indoctrinated into this one thing, and it was Anglo culture, English language, all of that.
And so that's very important. We should go on with the story, but it's very important for us to recognize and understand that the practice of Christianity, and I'm a Christian, but the practice of Christianity in this culture was used as a way to, as Samantha was talking about, othering, and completely disregarded the spiritual practices of the Native people in these communities. And similar to the story of when our enslavers, wanted to strip us away from our practice of our own spirituality, and then replace it with something that would be more in alignment with their thinking and their practice. And that's really, when you think about it, that's a really dehumanizing thing. And it's nothing, there's nothing in the sacred text for us, for me as a Christian, that would direct you to do that. Like somehow, we think of God as almighty and all powerful, but God somehow would need humans to enact a diabolical plot to disconnect another group of humans from their spirituality or their understanding of the Creator or the divine. That makes the God of Christianity, of the way they practice, is to be a very insecure God, right? If I'm almighty, I'm really not worried about what anybody else is really doing, right? Because I'm almighty, right? It's right. There's nothing, and that's what we say in our rhetoric, right? And that's what we say in our practice, right? So I don't want us to miss this point about the importance of people being able to self-identify and self-define themselves at every level of their being, not only in the natural element about appearance, but also in our interaction with the spiritual, with the divine, and to try to strip that from people because they're not like you is just really very, very, it's diabolical.
Yeah, and when you talk about it that way, it lends to the bigger point of the story. It's that the people that went through these things, they lost themselves at certain ages. They were there as young as, I want to say, 1, 2, 3, so they knew nothing else, or they were teenagers. And, at that point, you had lived all 14, 15, 16 years of your life living, believing that this was the one way of living life, and then it was stripped away from you. You were beat with rulers or whatever, or what have you. There were some residential schools that had, just these cement cellar type things where kids were put in basic, like solitary confinement for speaking their language. And there are documentaries and stories all over that I've seen of elders in the 90s, in the early 2000s, talking about their memories of these schools. And you can see the sorrow in their face. You can see that something was taken from them, whether it be their innocence, their personhood, right? A lot was taken in those years. And my own great grandmother, was in one of those schools. And it was one of those things where it was never talked about in the family. I didn't know that she was in one of those until a couple of years ago, talking to my great aunt, one of her daughters. And it's reminiscent of what happens in a lot of Native families. The elders don't talk about it, but then what comes out of it when people don't talk, when we're not addressing the mental health issues, when people don't address however they see it, whether it's depression, whether it's anger, utter and complete sadness. I believe that is something that just gets passed down, and it's what you know. And I say all that because when I look at my grandparent, or my great aunts and my great uncles, there tends to be a much more heavy-handed stoicism almost that kind of derives from that. We don't talk about this, but we're going to hold our heads up high kind of thing. And that just affects people. The same person who was 16 in one of these schools and then disregarded whatever age they got, sent back into society now that they were saved. It's very likely that they had hard times. My own father, I'm not ashamed to say, was an alcoholic, but it's because of the way that he found out that he was adopted when he was 18. He didn't know he was Seneca until he was 18. He knew he was adopted before he knew he was Cayuga, but he knew he was adopted before he was Cayuga, and that affected him. And you could see the kind of trajectory that he went on with his life because of that instance, not knowing his culture, not knowing who he was. On a large scale, talking about these residential schools, just a whole society basically thrown out and told, you're not who you thought you were. You're who we said you are. And then instances, and that's why there's, high prevalence of alcoholism, drug abuse, things of that nature. And it just perpetuates with every given generation that comes up. And so when I think of generational trauma, that's what I think of, is that we haven't fully healed. Because again, my great grandmother was in one of those schools. She raised a son who got together with my grandmother, who raised my mother. Yeah. Here I am.
And that's all it's tragic. In addition to that, we're learning that children were actually killed in those spaces, right? I mean, yes. There's this, and so they found skeletal remains underneath these sites of children. I mean, lots of them, and so
hundreds.
How does a community handle that truth?
I don't know how, honestly. I don't know how a community handles that truth. I know that for me, it makes me angry because, as I've mentioned, my community is very small. At present, there are roughly 8,000 registered Senecas. We're talking about hundreds of children that were lost at these schools. Think about how much larger our communities could have been. Technically, I have a lot of cousins. Technically, I have a lot of, aunts and uncles and just all kinds of family I've never met before. People can relate to that, but I don't know them. Because just all of the fracturing that happens through these generational traumas. My mother moved to Buffalo because she didn't want to be around certain things that were going around on the reservation. And again, I believe it's all connected to that generational trauma and what people go through, or worse, don't go through.
Accountability it kind of comes to mind here, right? So, we have a lot of conversations in the African American community about reparations, and I'm a strong supporter of that. And I always use this analogy of, if I came to to your home and slapped you upside the head on Monday, slapped you upside the head on Tuesday, and stole from you. And then I come to your house on Wednesday and say, hey, my bad, I'm sorry. You got to make things right. You can't just say you're sorry. You have to give account to what you've taken from me on those other days when you were harming me. We can't start the relationship from my apology. So how do we push forward a sense of, well, there's got to be some accountability for these atrocities that were inflicted upon our ancestors, and in some ways through systemic and institutional racism. And there's still this infliction of trauma, of hurt, of harm, of othering. How do we get to a point where we hold people accountable so that we can move forward?
It's a hard one, at least for the people who could make it right? They tend to believe, well, noses, it's not my turn. I'm not the one who needs to do this. I didn't do anything. Why do we have to, make things right? Oh, Lord, that one. And then the way you bring it up with accountability, it's kind of like the current news with what's going on with the nation and the casino revenues and what's going on with the New York State. So for a little bit of context, back in 2002, there was an original gaming compact that was written. It was a contract between the New York State under Pataki, I believe, and with the Seneca Nation that granted exclusivity rights of casino gaming in Western New York, I believe, west of Geneva. So what that meant was that we had exclusive. We were the only ones who were allowed to operate casinos in this area back in 2002 when it was obviously not a very popular thing. My guess is people didn't think it would, take off here. And then all these years later, the Senecas, as a corporation, the Seneca Gaming Corporation, made millions upon millions of dollars. It was in the contract that the municipalities that hosted these casinos, Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and Salamanca, would get so much percentage of these monies. Everything went to Albany. Albany then filtered it down to the municipalities. I believe it was 2017 or 2018. The contract was up. It was renegotiated and rewritten. However, it wasn't explicitly stipulated in a contract that the payments to the state needed to continue. So the way I understand it, the way that it was rewritten was exclusivity was maintained for the Seneca Nation. However, it was not explicit that payments needed to continue to New York State, to the municipalities. That has been fought. Governor Cuomo at the time was the one who said, no, clearly that is not, in my mind, is not what we meant. That's not what we meant. Okay. So there ensues another, I believe it was 5 years. So maybe it was 2016 that this happened. Another 5 years of back and forth litigation in the courts. It went through all kinds of court systems. Eventually, through mediation, through the courts, it was found that the nation should continue to pay the money. Now, that money was always held in escrow, so that money was there. The nation
whose courts determined that they should make that the payment should be made?
Oh, it was Court of Appeals, New York State. I forget.
So it was a state court, but not a Seneca court.
Correct.
Because you have your own court system, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to make that clear.
Mm-hmm.
So the court said,
Senecas
owe this money, right?
Right. And it's not like the nation was spending it and all of the citizens were getting, X amount of checks and dollars and all of that. The money was sitting there and accruing interest in a separate account. So the money was always there. So fast forward, all of these things have happened. And now the nation has taken it to the Biden administration. They've taken it to the Department of the Interior. Deb Haaland, who is also Native, she is, I forgot what nation she is, but out of New Mexico, that area.
And she's the first Secretary of Interior from the Native community, right?
Yes.
Is she okay. Yeah.
First,
okay.
Yep. Her and one other were also first Native American Congresswoman. Just put that out there in her lifetime. Right. So there are all these avenues that the nation's trying to pursue to say, no, this isn't what was in the contract. And then it was last week that the governor had the nation's bank accounts with KeyBank frozen, so that there was no ability to get money out. And now this isn't like...
Was it frozen in the midst of the negotiations, or was there hey, listen, we got to try to get this thing resolved. I'm going to have to freeze your accounts till we get you back to the table? Or was it just like, hey, wait, our accounts are frozen?
So I want to preface this with I do not know the ins and outs, as in I do not work for the government at the Seneca Nation, all that.
Right.
But from my understanding, the way we talked about it, and again, this happened so recently, we talked about it after services for my grandmother, and the way I saw it was the nation's accounts were frozen, and because there was no end date, we didn't know when that was. There were people who worked for Seneca Gaming who didn't know if their paychecks would be coming because the accounts were frozen, and that means natives and non-natives. So a lot of people in Western New York, because it's a major employer in Western New York.
And not everybody that works there is from the Native community. That's a very important point. Okay.
Correct. But then even so, the nation was saying that if, with no end in sight, how will they pay to distribute medications? I myself, I work for $11.99 now and great benefits. I love the union. But if I didn't have them, I would be dependent on the nation for my medications, for any of those kinds of services. They paid for my school, and with no end in sight, how would they pay for these things? How would I get my medications? My grandmother, before she passed, was living in nation elder housing, which meant that what services could they provide her? Who would be there to, help her, or any of the elders that live within these housing systems if someone fell, but then people weren't getting paid to be there, that kind of thing, right? So it was a complete disruption, not just to the corporation and people's paychecks, but just people's lives. And for me personally, this is the part where I got really angry at this. I saw the news article about the bank accounts being frozen. I get that there is a strong arm. It was a strong arm tactic by the governor of New York, Governor Kathy Hochul, to say, you need to pay up. The courts all said, we've been fighting this for years. You owe us the money. She said, okay, now you're just going to pass. You're not going to have any access to anything. It's not just access to payroll again. Remember, access to life. And I felt that was extremely in poor taste, but it was just, an extremely nasty way to go about doing these things, doing business. And then to turn around and find out there's all this state money that's going to a Bills stadium. Now, I like the Bills more than just about as much as everyone else. Stephon Diggs getting signed, cool. I love it. I'm excited. But the thought of all of this money getting, and then she says basically outright in the Buffalo News, well, this is Western New York money, so we're just going to make sure that it goes to, mind you, the work that I do. The governor has a lot to do with, my union and the people that work within the union, all of that. So you're telling me that you took from my people who provide for our people, and you're not even giving it to safe staffing. You're not even giving it to nursing homes that need it. You're giving it to the Bills? It was a slap in the face as a citizen of the nation and just someone who cares about people who aren't, native.
And the leadership there was very clear about that. They were extremely unhappy with the tactics, but then also how this money was going to be spent. And this is very problematic, but I think it's related to just that our original conversation that we were having, Sam, about othering, about thinking people that they're less than who they are, and that you have you can impinge upon a person's existence, their land, their religion, their hairstyle, their wherever they deem to do, that you, in your position of authority, right, have the right to go and just impinge that into just take, because they just, you could see because there's a lot of arguments to be made here, right? I mean, there was a deal that was struck. You're in the middle of negotiations. Just because, a non-native court makes a ruling, that does not necessarily bind the Seneca Nation to adhere to those things. I mean, you just have to continue to negotiate and come up with something that's going to be fair and equitable for everyone. And quite frankly, because we started this conversation, around reparation and stuff like that, I would argue that the Seneca Nation doesn't owe New York State anything. ever.
Right, but you're not going to get Kathy Hochul or anybody in leadership in our life.
On the moral side.
Oh, you're right. And you're right.
Yeah.
It's my turn. I'll be the one that makes sure that this gets done.
You know, I mean,
you're not going to get that.
And that's why it's so important, Samantha, to have this truth telling, to really tell people the story. You know what I mean? The truth. Because those actions of freezing, this very hostile freezing of accounts, doing all this other stuff, and then transferring it, not into something that, like you said, like paying healthcare workers or schools or something like that to help the poor, but to finance a recreational entertainment facility out of those dollars. It just doesn't feel right. It's not, I don't think it's helping us to get to the point where we want to bring a more equitable society, address these issues of health disparities, address these things about trauma that's causing these mental health issues and all this other stuff. It's just it seems like just another way to inflict. It's just adding another chapter to that story of, it's almost kind of sending a message, say, well, yeah, you guys were successful with this casinos, but just recognize this. We still have the power here.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean,
the
way I look at it, it's just that, there's this, it's the freezing of the accounts, one. That's one big thing. The money that is owed to New York State that would have been filtered down to the municipalities was in a separate account. The money exists. It's in a pot, right? They didn't have to freeze the other accounts. The money was there. We were good for it. They froze accounts, again, that affected people's livelihoods and people wondering if they were going to get paid next week, that kind of thing. So that was a really strong arm tactic that said, well, we don't care about your people. It's also obvious that they don't care about the fact that this was a government to government kind of relationship. You can't, I don't feel like you should be able to just do that to another government. What you can do legally, I'm not sure. But remember, just because something's legal doesn't mean it's right. So the fact that New York State felt like they could do this and to affect a large portion, for me, a significant portion of people, it was that's a dehumanizing tactic right there. And again, something that New York State said, well, we're sorry, we're going to treat you as if you're, you make hats or you're a manufacturing company. And we'll freeze your accounts that way, and that's how we get our money. No, my government helps people. I have been a benefactor of many benefits of the Seneca Nation government. So all of that to say is, yeah, the nation, I believe, did what it needed to do. Again, I don't know the ins and outs of everything that happened, but as far as I can tell, had it been the other way around, had New York State lost in the courts and had New York State, not come up with what they needed in order to get this money, they would have exhausted every appeals and every last little thing that they could do before, giving up and saying, I guess we lost. They would have exhausted every last thing and every last dollar they had to contribute to that effort. The nation was still waiting on the Department of the Interior to hear what they could do. So we hadn't exhausted everything just yet.
When you look at things from a historical standpoint, and we have to wrap this up, it shouldn't be about winning and losing. When we think about governments, institutions, and you think about historical trauma, institutional racism, structural racism, generational trauma, the benefit that the country and American businesses, international businesses have benefited from just the inception of how this republic was. You steal it and then you take others to work it. Yeah, you're going to be pretty successful, I think. I mean, that's a pretty good start. There's no bootstraps. And this is a reality, and that's not to take away from any of the noble actions of individuals that work the land and all that. I get it. But it's got to impact how we interact now, right? That there's got to be a level of humility that New York State comes to the table with the Seneca Nation. It's so what if the Seneca Nation has made a lot of money off of gaming and whatever. No matter what you make out of that, it'll never be able to be a fair and equitable exchange for what was done to Native people. The genocide that was, a result of this experiment, American experiment. And then the child abuse. Under every definition of child abuse. That's what these schools were. They weren't schools. They were centers for child abuse that not only resulted in people being stripped of their cultural identities, but also there was a lot of sexual improprieties, violence against children in these institutions, and this is real stuff. So when you have people that's part of their history, right? When you come to the table with them about an issue now, you have to come with some humility and with a heart to try to figure out how do we resolve this conflict in such a way where each party goes away from the table whole in some ways, right? But to be heavy-handed and to just to almost think that you have that right, it just speaks of just the continual cycle of colonialism and just all the darkness of our story, that we're working so hard to be, we try so hard to be the best citizens that we can. We really do. When you look at the history of African people in America, of indigenous people in America, and the fact that we're not just completely rebellious and recalcitrant at every level, right, based on our history, the fact that we even try to be good citizens, to be contributors, and we do a great job of contributing to this story of this country. And yet we still, and even when you achieve some success, there's still that prospect of abuse, of injustice. And, it's just disheartening. It's really disheartening. But it also fuels, those kinds of things, those stories, those acts of injustice. After you get over your anger, right? But then that just fuels you to say, yeah, that's why I'm fighting. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's why I'm an activist. That's why I'm a community organizer, whatever, the title that you want to do. That's why we don't, you could be a good citizen without assimilating, right? And so, but you could still hold to your identity and you could still advocate for your people. So we thank you so much for this conversation. You wanted to just give us a closing, and then I'll wrap this up. But thank you for sharing. I thank you for your friendship. One of the benefits that I have from hosting this podcast is most of the people that you'll hear on our podcast are not only outstanding people in the work that they do, but they're my friends. And it's good to know that, there are people of this kind of character that are in my circle. And I appreciate you so much, Sam, for what you do. And
I am an activist, I'm an organizer, I'm all of that, but I consider myself a storyteller. And I think that's important because, like you were mentioning, was, the truths. If we don't tell our truths and if we don't talk about our experiences, then we are doomed to rely on what's fed to us. I've never really been too keen on the idea of just being told what to do. It explains a lot, actually. But, I like to ask why, and I like to ask, well, who said that this has to be the way that it has to be? And the way I approach life is trying to be a storyteller, whether it's organizing, going through a leadership development thing with a community leader and making sure that they know how to tell their own stories, or even going on this podcast. Who knows, maybe one day I'll write a book and talk about my experience. But it's all important because nobody knows what it's like to be a Native person in an urban community. You've mentioned the word other so much in this podcast and all these different kinds of things, but it's a different perspective. And I'm a big fan of making sure that we know everything outside of the status quo. Making sure that we know that there are all kinds of things that we need to be, watching out for, especially in the work that, the three of us do in health equity, because sometimes we miss things ourselves. And so it's that story piece as it relates to our experiences and within our cultures, in our communities, that I think is really important. So happy to come on another time if you invite me. So I will leave it with that.
Always. Great. All right. Thank you. So this has been the Igniting Hope podcast with your host, Pastor George Nicholas. And just reminding you, if you have any questions about what the work we're doing, go to buffalohealthequity.org, buffalohealthequity.org. And so for Samantha Nephew and Kim Slu Harambe, bid you good day and just stay encouraged and be intentional about your love for others. Don't talk about love and humanity. take some deliberate and intentional actions in your daily walk to express your love for someone today. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been Igniting Hope Radio. Thank you for tuning in for your weekly dose of hope. And we ask you listeners to please share, like, subscribe, whether it be on Spotify, Apple, whatever your podcast listening platform is. Share it with a friend and tell us what you think. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and be healthy.